Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first session of the show. My name is Steve Smedes, and I am a VP of Customer Success at Knowbly. We are a rapid authoring software platform in the cloud that help people create very engaging and interactive courses and learning objects for people. But one interesting little thing about our company is we've been around for 10 years, and we actually played quite a bit in the higher education space when we first started. We started as a creative agency taking paper textbooks and turning them into digital experiences for students about 10 years ago. So this leads us to the topic of our talk today, is there's 5 now. What corporate training can really learn from higher education? So we want to take a little bit of what we understand about higher education from our work in that field and bring it over to the corporate training market that we're working now with our software platform. So what is the challenge we're going to explore today is how do you create effective content to upskill and train a diverse, multi-generational workforce in a universal and accessible way? This has been a big problem for corporations lately. About half of workers surveyed say they do not get enough new skills and training development at their current workspace. And it gets even worse the older you get. Workers over 55, over half said they have not learned any new skills in the last year. So this is a big problem for your workforce if they're not upskilling and learning new things as they go. But there's a problem for companies today, and that is the distribution in the labor force. So this shows how the labor force was split up back in 1994, and you kind of had a predictable lump of people coming out of college and working in their careers. But something very interesting is happening nowadays that show how this is going to change over the next 5 years. So the projected age groupings in 2024, 5 years from now, actually shows the biggest group of workforce are going to be ages 55 and over. The generations are really shifting. People are staying in the workforce a lot longer, and that's making the diversity of your workforce grow quite a bit. So this is an interesting problem that people are going to have, is how do you actually train all these new workers that are coming in? And this brings in a lot of generational differences too. And before I get into this, I always like to say a little caveat before I start. This is not one size fits all. Just because you're of one generation doesn't mean you have all the characteristics of that generation. There are baby boomers who are really good at Snapchat, and there are also millennials who don't like to spend 8 hours a day on their phone. So these are stereotypes and kind of bell curves, not one size fits all for everybody. But there are some characteristics that go along with generations in the workforce. And for a little history of how these groups developed, you had the baby boomers coming up in the post-war period, economic expansion, everything was booming. Everyone was promised that dream of a white picket fence and a house and 2.5 kids, and everybody pursued that with gusto with the baby boomers. And then you had the Gen X kids that came along, and we call this the latchkey kid generation. As their parents were off pursuing the dream, they were often left at home and to themselves. They also kind of question a little bit. They're like, Mom and Dad are pursuing this dream, but they don't seem very happy. I'm not sure this is for me. So Gen X disconnected a little bit, was much more independent and competitive, and didn't need to chase everything quite as much as their parents did. And then Gen Y came along, what we call millennials, and they had different challenges. This was the first kind of helicopter parenting generation, where we really talked a lot about how these kids were raised up, that everybody gets a trophy. They were not exposed to the challenges of the world quite as early as some of the other generations. They also had a lot of economic stability. They were not driven to go seek out. A lot of them still live at home. So this generation had its own kind of things. And then finally we have Gen Z coming up, and this generation's coming like a freight train. There's going to be about 60 million of them entering the workforce over the next few years. And these also have their own set of challenges. What's interesting about them is a lot of them say they do want to achieve financial independence. They are much more driven to leave the house, go out and earn a living for themselves because they lived through a recession. They understand economic hardship. They also grew up in a world where they're just digital natives. They were born with a phone in their hand. They don't know anything else. If you try to train them with things that are not digital, they're just kind of like, I don't even understand what this is. This isn't for me. They have been using technology from the day they were born. So Gen Z comes up with a lot of different expectations. One little bit of hope, a statistic I just heard that I really liked, is about 55% of Gen Z prefers face-to-face communications over digital, which is a big change for the millennials. So these generations take what their previous generations learned and adapt it and change it for themselves. Now, what this means in a corporate environment is you have a lot of different challenges for how these people like to work. And some of the three big differences for the generations are in management preferences. The older generations really they know what they need to achieve. They want managers who are fair and balanced, where younger generations are looking for more coaching and more mentoring from their management. They're also very different in how they like to collaborate together. Baby boomers are very much, give me what my job is. I want to come in, earn a fair day work for a fair day wage, and that's what I want to do. Gen X are more, I want to work independently, leave me alone. I don't want a lot of micromanagement. Gen Y and Gen Z are very much more collaborative. They like working together, but they also need more structure. It can be kind of like herding cats if you don't set them all on the right path together and move them along that path. So they all collaborate and work very differently. And they also have different expectations of what they want to get out of work. What's interesting as you survey the different generations, the five same things keep popping up, but the order of preference and priority are very much flipped. For older generations, it's very much pay and benefits. That's what I'm looking for. I want to know what I'm going to be paid. I want to be taken care of as I get older. Benefits are important to me. Younger generations, Gen Z, that almost flips on its head. Pay and benefits are much less important to them as what is my career progress going to be? What skills I'm going to be picking up in this job? And what is the purpose of this job? I look at work as a way of giving back to the world. So I need to not just come in and punch a time clock. I need to be doing something that I feel is purposeful and important in the world. So what these folks are looking for out of work changes quite a bit too. So this leads to a kind of a big challenge, is how do you actually train all this diversity? Now the good news is there are things that are very similar for all these generations. Pretty much everybody prefers flex time, likes to have a good work-life balance. Everybody likes recognition at work for a job well done. And everybody wants to make an impact. So there is hope out there. There are ways that these people can work together and common goals you can put together. One other thing I'll mention, this is more on a personal note rather than generations, but this is just changing the way we need to learn in our careers for everybody. And there's three really impacts on this. As you can see, life expectancy is going up and up. They say kids born in their 20s today have a very high expectation of living to be 100. So life expectancy is growing. At the same time, skill relevance is going down. They basically say half-life of skills is now down to about just 2 years, that you have to constantly retrain yourself, and what you learned in school is not going to take you the distance to the end of their career. One of the kind of ways I like to illustrate this is they say the old model used to be, in your younger years you got educated, in your middle years you worked, and in your later years you had your leisure, you retired. That model isn't really true anymore for a lot of people. We've now moved to a model where it's education, work, education, work, education, and work. You'll go through this 4 or 5 times in your lifetime where you need to retrain yourself and learn new skills and learn a new career. And then hopefully you find some way to fit leisure in somewhere along the way. That's kind of gotten lost a little bit in the new reality. But it's changing the way people need to learn and to keep their skills relevant as they progress through their lifetimes. Finally, there's also a new economic reality. It's just not full-time work anymore. We call this the elastic workforce. You have a workforce coming in from around the world. You can have outsourced workers. You can have part-time workers. You can have temps. You can have people from different companies in different countries. Your workforce is no longer in one building in one company working the same hours. They're just really spread out, looking for new undervalued resources, freelancers. There are so many different types of people in a modern workplace now. So you bring this all together, and this is the challenge, is how can you do effective learning for all these different types of peoples that you're dealing with in your modern workplace? So the example we want to talk about today is something that's used in education these days, which is Universal Design for Learning, UDL. And what this is the design of products and environments to be used by all people to the greatest extent possible without need for adaptation or specialized design. So to get into the history of this just a little bit, this actually stopped from a gentleman named Ron Case back in North Carolina State University, and he was actually working on accessibility for architecture, for buildings, thinking of new ways to help buildings be more accessible to everything. And one of the big flashes that he got, one of the most interesting things was what he realized is if you design things to be accessible, it actually benefits everybody. A good design doesn't just take in how can we help these additional people, but it actually benefits everything. By addressing that complexity and making it very simple, everybody can take advantage of it. So the two quick examples of this from architecture would be sliding automatic doors. At first, these were designed to help people who had difficulties opening doors for whatever reasons, but we've realized there's a lot of benefits to sliding doors. You're carrying a heavy set of boxes. You have a lot of people going in and out. It helps air conditioning because it helps people who forget to close the door behind them. So automatic doors are a great example that started for something to be accessible but had benefits for everybody. Another great example is closed captioning. I don't know, everybody here may not have serious hearing challenges, but a lot of you have probably used closed captioning in your lives. And this is because it's very useful. You're at a sports bar and you want to see the score, but you can't hear it. Or your spouse is sleeping next to you on bed. You throw on closed captioning. So it's another example of universal design that works for everybody, even though it's very focused on helping a specific group of people. And so you want to take this universal design and take it to a lot of places. Just to give you kind of a concrete example of the progression here, we can start with how do you make a Rubik's Cube more accessible? Well, this is good for a lot of people, but if you're visually impaired or blind, good luck solving a Rubik's Cube. You're going to have a lot of problems. So the first stab at it was to make the Rubik's Cube more accessible. And if you can see up there, they actually put Braille on each of the squares so you can read and you can see the color. Well, now this was a decent solution for blind people. Now you can actually play Rubik's Cube, but this serves almost no purpose to anyone else in the world unless you happen to be able to read Braille. Nobody else can come up and use this unless you know that, and you can see there's no colors on it either. So now you have to build two Rubik's Cube, one for this and then one for the small set of the population that's visually impaired that really has no use for anyone else. So where universal design comes in is the third example, where you actually build something that actually is useful for everybody, and instead of Braille, you use raised things you can feel with your finger that have different shapes. Now this design is useful for visually impaired people, but can also be used for a lot of other people. Maybe you're in a dark room, maybe you're colorblind. There's a lot of use for this universal design that makes the Rubik's Cube better for everybody and not just visually impaired. So when we talk about universal design, this is what we're going for. And so now we want to talk a little bit about how this can be actually applied in a learning context. So why do you use universal design in training? Well, one of the big things that's been busted recently is the myth of the average learner. Every individual is really unique as their fingerprint in how they like to learn, and there are tons of different ways to learn. There are people that are spatial reasoners, sequential reasoners, tactile reasoners. There are so many different ways people can learn, and it's useful to address them where they live, how they need to pick that up. The example I use for this is a seed. You plant a seed in a tropical rainforest and it grows into a beautiful plant. You're like, great, that worked perfectly. You take that exact same seed and bring it over and plant it in Antarctica, it doesn't grow so well. Now, do you blame the seed for being disadvantaged or not useful when you plant it in Antarctica? It's not the seed's fault, it's the environment it's in. And that's the same case we're really making for training as well. Because people learn in so many different ways, you don't want just one path for that learning to take, one way they can pick up that material, or you're going to be leaving a lot of people behind. If you design just for the average learner, anyone who's not average, which is basically everybody, may struggle. So just as you don't blame the seed for not growing, you don't blame the learner if they need a different approach to actually pick up the materials. And this is where it comes in for the workforce being more diverse than ever before. It provides an equal opportunity for everyone to succeed. You give multiple paths for people to do this. So once you start practicing universal design, the benefits become obvious. And making that accessible means you can pick up a lot more of your workforce. One little statistic not a lot of folks talk about, but they say about 15% of adults have learning disabilities that they either don't even know about or they don't report to their employer. Many people do struggle with this, but they keep it to themselves, and they may not even be aware of it themselves. So you got to keep in that mind, you may be teaching people that have some challenges and aren't even aware of it. So universal design is really useful for picking up and making sure you don't leave anyone behind. So where does universal design for learning actually come from? So we want to get into the neuroscience of this just a little bit on why this works the way it does in the brain. And what they've broken it down to is there are basically 3 different networks in the brain that are responsible for learning. And as you guys may be aware with how the brain works, you have your neurons on the top thin layer of cortex, but then great connectivity between all those neurons. Trillions and trillions of connections, the most connected object we know about in the universe. And all those connections make networks where if you put someone in an MRI, you can light up and see how those networks operate when they're thinking about certain things. So through that scientific experiments, they've basically determined these 3 different networks really light up when people are trying to learn a new object. So the first one is the recognition network, really the what of learning. And this is just gathering all the stimulus, how you gather the facts, categorize what you see, read, and hear. And this is processed towards the back of the brain. It's always been fascinating to me that your eyes bring in the visual, but it takes it all the way back to the brain to actually get processed. As an engineer, that seems kind of like bad wiring to me, but that's just the way it works. So that's the recognition. We're taking in all the data from outside. The second network that lights up during learning is the strategic network, really the how of learning. And this is processing all that information is coming in and also using background or past knowledge to basically flavor and to color that knowledge. Teaching your brain what to pay attention to and what's not. And we do this so often and so much in our everyday life that we don't even realize it. You may have seen some of those visual things in perspective where 2 squares actually look to be different colors because our brains are seeing it that way, or lines that look parallel really are not. And this is all because your brain does so much processing to try to figure out what it's saying, so you're not dealing with just that raw data that's coming in. It does a lot of thinking for you that you're not even aware of at the conscious level. The final network that's really affected when learning is the affective network, the why of learning. This is really in your amygdala and is really tied into your emotions. What I kind of love about this is learning is very much built into the same reward system we use. If you may be aware that the brain basically produces dopamine to help guide you towards rewards. So this is either when you're getting a new reward or thinking about getting a reward, your dopamine system lights up and that's the reward you get that helps drive you. The example I used to I really like pizza, trying to watch the weight a little bit, but I can actually see it myself. The moment I say, forget about the diet, I'm going to get that pizza, I get a little dopamine rush. Try it yourself the next time you do something that's maybe a little bit bad for you, you'll actually get that little rush of dopamine just from the anticipation of that reward. So that's the way the brain kind of drives us towards good things. And the fascinating thing is knowledge actually works exactly the same as rewards in the brain. We get the same dopamine rush when we learn new things or when we anticipate learning new knowledge. We're about to embark on a new learning adventure. We get the same dopamine rush, the same reward pathways light up in the brain. Now, one caveat to that is the one place it doesn't work is if you think you have certain knowledge and you encounter knowledge that contradicts that. All of a sudden, that doesn't give you a dopamine rush. The brain goes, something's wrong with this. And this is the infamous confirmation bias that is causing so much havoc and everything in politics today. So your brain doesn't like encountering information it didn't expect, but it really likes encountering new information out there. So the brain is really primed to drive towards new information. The other warning here, though, is the brain will push that down if it thinks it's under risk. The reward system works great, but is secondary to the fight or flight system if you think you're under threat. And this is what they've learned again and again in schools and education, that if you have a good environment where you tell people they will learn and they can see this material, if you take one group of kids and tell them that and take another group of kids and put them in a normal situation, the group of the kids that encouraged and that's told that they would succeed in this do much better on tests. And that's because it's tied into the affective network. They are actually looking at this as a positive reward rather than something to be feared, rather as a threat. So it's very important for learning that you trigger that affective network in the right way. And so how this all kind of breaks down in the head with those different networks is these are the principles of UDL and how you learn. So you basically have the representation networks, your options for perception, how you process your vocabulary and symbols, and how you actually support comprehension for people. And then this ties into how do you actually express that back out through either physical action, your expression and communications, and your executive functions, how you strategize with this information. And then finally, the engagement network, the effective network, the emotions behind it? Are you recruiting interest? Are you sustaining their effort and persistence? And provide options for self-regulation. And what's interesting about this is actually a model for the very top of the peak for an effective learner out there. You want learners who are driven, who understand knowledge, can take in new knowledge and process that. You want learners who can strategize and do interesting things with that knowledge, and you want learners that are always driving to learn new things. So if you can trigger all three of these networks in the brain, you will get the optimal learner that you want in your corporate environment. Huh? So let's break down each of these just a little bit more as we get into this. So multiple means of representation, how can you actually do that on a practical level in your workforce? Well, one of the big things is you want to deliver the information in different ways, and this is where the accessibility comes into it. Some people respond very well to written word, others to video, others to audio. There's lots of different ways you can display information to people. So you want to allow the learner to customize the display of their information and offer alternatives for consuming that information. Then you also want to have a scaffolding for your learners. You want to basically clarify your vocabulary and your symbols and actually have the basics there if they are struggling with them. So you want to define and explain all your nomenclature and symbols. You also have to take your English language learners, and not everybody's first language is English. So you got to promote understanding across languages. Use icons and pictures instead of words where you can. If you can, there's a new concept called adaptive learning, where you kind of see how much knowledge they have, and if they need to take a step back and do some remedial knowledge, you can do that in your learning. Maybe they don't have the core concepts they need to succeed. You can realize that in the course of your training and back it up a little bit. Give that scaffolding that they need to succeed, because not everybody is going to start at the same place. And then again, you can have those illustrations through multiple media, depending on how different people like to pick that up. And then you want to support that comprehension by aggregating that background knowledge. You always want to make it personal, tie it back into things that they already know. You want to highlight patterns, critical features, and ideas, and then guide information processing and visualization. The example I like to use this, there's a teacher out there that was trying to teach classical music to his kids. And he's really struggling to get across what's beautiful about classical music, the complexity. And I've never been much for classical music myself. I like to listen to it. But what he had done is he did a visual multimedia display of classical music that actually showed the lengths, the bars, and the patterns of the music. And it was fascinating to me watching this musical really made it click of the complexity of this music and the same patterns Beethoven and Mozart were using again and again. You could see in a way visually that, at least for me, I struggle to get audio, through my ears. Now, other people who are great at music probably would have no problem picking that up. But providing multiple means to display that information helped me, who might struggle a little bit with the audio, understand it from a visual perspective. And that's really what you want to do. And one of the most famous examples of why this is so important would be Albert Einstein. When they actually examined his brain after his death, they realized a huge part of his representational network was devoted to spatial reasoning. He actually didn't have a lot of real estate left for text and audio. And infamously, he struggled in school. You know, the way his teachers represented information was not the way that Einstein thought. He thought on a much deeper spatial reasoning about complicated physics. He was bored trying to read text, listen to audio. And so even though he struggled in school, nobody would really consider him disabled or a bad learner. It's just that the information wasn't represented to him in a way that his brain wanted to receive it, the way that his brain worked. So always consider multiple ways of expressing information to your learners. Finally, we have action and expression. What are they going to do with that information? And this is very important to allow them to demonstrate the knowledge in different ways. The important thing is, did they actually pick up the information, not necessarily how they represent it back to you. So you want to vary methods for response and navigation, offer that assistive technology if you need it for accessibility. But you want to offer them ways to convey key concepts and to have that composition work for them. So offer those levels of support, practice, and performance. So an example I like to use about this is there's a teacher trying to teach fractions in school. And he had a very set way, the way they needed to present that back to him. They had to cut out pieces of paper and glue it to represent the different fractions. And a lot of his students were struggling with this. And what he realized is they weren't struggling with the core concept of fractions, they were struggling with the crafts part of the assignment, how to cut out the paper and paste it in the right place and make these fractions. He's like, this isn't even what I'm trying to teach them. I'm not trying to teach them crafts, I'm trying to teach them fractions, but the test is making them do all this extra stuff that is not part of the core concept. So he actually relaxed a little bit. He said, you know what, you can represent the way you understand fractions any ways you like. So some kids colored on sticks, some kids baked cakes. He was amazed with the variety of ways students came up to demonstrate how they understood fractions to him. And he said it was great for him because it allowed him to spark his creativity, help get concepts across to other students who maybe one of those ways resonated better with them than pieces of paper glued to a page. And so by opening up the way they can express their knowledge, you help other people learn and you help them really capture inside of themselves and say, I can express this to you, I understand the materials, rather than locking them into one size fits all, and if you can't march this march, then you didn't learn the materials, because that's just not the way it's true for everybody. And then another important part of expression is constant feedback. You always want to work with them, give them feedback as they go. So many things are set up where the feedback comes at the end. Well, here's your grade. Well, that's great, but how is that helping them learn along the way? That just says whether they passed or failed. So it's really important in this process that you give that constant feedback to your learners to help them know that they are expressing things, that they are picking up the concepts correctly. Finally, in the engagement network, this is all about motivating through challenge and contact. Really, and a lot of this, what they find is really useful is optimizing individual choice and making it actually relevant to you. So if you're trying to teach kids a math problem, make the math problem something that's important to them. Now, do use this a little bit of care. Like one example people use is, well, maybe I do my math problem using sports. Well, sports doesn't necessarily resonate with every one of your students. So maybe one thing you can do is give them multiple options. You can have this math student as a sports problem, or a geography problem, or counting dogs and cats problem. There's lots of different ways you can get the same concept across that'll be relevant to that particular learner. And then by giving them choice of how they want to do it, would you like to do problem A, B, or C? It helps them actually take ownership of it. Since I made a choice, I feel much more connected to this personally. So offer choices wherever you can when you're engaging people with learning. And again, as I stated kind of earlier, you really want to minimize your threats and distractions as you go. Anytime you put a student into a red zone where they're more worried about how they're going to be perceived, or if they're going to get laughed at, or if they're going to fail, they're not going to be in a good place with that effective network to really engage with that learning. So you want to minimize that as much as possible. A lot of it is group activities really help with this a lot. You want to do collaboration and emphasize group goals with everybody. This helps everybody bring each other along, and it helps learn from each other. It's a much more powerful thing for people to learn together rather than just have somebody come up there and lecture to them. And finally, you want to support comprehension with this as well. You want to provide those opportunities for self-assessment as they go. Again, you don't want to just give them a score at the end. You want to give them a measure for how they're doing as they proceed. You also want to talk about why this is relevant to them. How is this learning going to make your life better? So promote expectations that help motivate them. And then you also always want to help with coping skills and strategies. People will get stressed. People will get frustrated. You need to be on the lookout for them and give them a little escape valve. Give them ways they can express that stress. And you can say, it's okay. Everybody struggles with this. Here's how you can achieve additional help. Don't just leave them on their own struggling with it. Make sure they know that there's people there to help. There's a support network there to help them. And this will all help them trigger and really lean into the learning that you're trying to do. So just kind of a final thoughts to kind of wrap up all this. One of the big paradigms, really what this shifts on its head, is the core traditional training and education was that one curriculum was and must be the center of the learning experience. That one curriculum fit all. And in some ways, historically, this made sense because what we used for a century was print. And print was very fixed and inflexible. It's hard to update a textbook. It takes a long time to do that. It's hard to bring in new information. So teaching really adapted to the limitations of the media at the time, which was print. This actually moved into our popular language as being called book smart. Well, why are people called book smart? It's because they were able to see it at school, and they were able to see it because they were able to deal with the print media, text media. But as we know, that doesn't work for everybody. People have dyslexia, people have reading challenges. Not everybody is necessarily book smart, but everybody can be smart and learn. So again, we don't want to label anyone who struggles with that one-size-fits-all as disabled, underachieving, or failing. It is because the curriculum itself was defining that learner. So what this UDL turns on its head is moving away from the curriculum being the center and put the learner at the center. Adapt to the diversity and variability of all your learners, because it does exist. And if you don't, you're going to leave people behind. So your successful training needs to be nimble and adjust to the interest of all your learners. And you want to plan right from the start for that variability. Variability is planned for, and the diversity is expected, appreciated, and developed. And this is actually good for your company as well. There's the term cognitive diversity, that the more different types of people you have, the more different brains you have that think about different ways about a problem will help you find solutions, will help you be more successful. You don't want a bunch of robots that all think exactly the same way. You want to foster that diversity and variability. And when you support that, it's not to say you give people an out. You still support high expectations. You expect results for all learners. You're just giving them multiple paths by which to achieve it, whichever resonates with them the most. So you want to generate learning opportunities that enable all those learners to reach the goals that matter, foster it through individual challenges that resonate with them, make sure they stay enthusiastic and motivated as they go. And the beautiful thing about this is if you do this right, you're not producing something that's just an expert in one specific category. You're actually teaching people how to learn. You're generating lifelong learners who will actually then help lift up others. People are interested in learning for itself and not just to pick up a skill. And the interesting thing about all of this is when you start applying it, the system itself starts being smart in this way. When you have a system that's made up of learners, it starts becoming adaptable. It starts dealing with diversity because of all the learners who come up through that system. So your system itself starts taking on these characteristics if you can build it in from the beginning. So just to give you one last kind of example to take away from this, a perfect example of universal design is the GPS system. Now this is a system that deals with so much variability from people, whether you're in a truck, you're in a bus, you're walking on the street, you're in a boat. So it's dealing with lots of different ways people need that, and lots of different ways people can enter the information. Where do you want to get to? Do you want to enter an address? Do you want to enter a place name? And then it actually optimizes for your individual how you need to get there, and actually gives you several different routes. It gets you options. Would you like to take a route on the highway? Would you take a shorter route? Would you like to take a cheaper route? It gives users multiple options. So GPS is a perfect example of a system that adapts to variability, gives people multiple options of expression, and helps them actually get to their destination. So if anything I could leave you with, I really think our corporate training needs this same kind of GPS. It needs to be like GPS in that it's innovative, it enhances flexibility and individuality to really remake the way teaching and learning happen for everybody. So if we can build a system like that that lets everybody move along and actually achieve the same goal, everybody's corporation will be a lot better off. All right, and that's my spiel. I'll open up to any questions or answers. Questions, I guess. All right. Well, if there are no questions today, we're Knowbly. We're right over there, booth 41, right behind the show there. We'd love you to stop by and come talk about this chat or anything else you'd like to. Thank you, everybody.